are listening to Texas History Lessons, a slow walk through Texas history made in Texas by a Texan for everyone, everywhere.
Welcome to Texas History Lessons. I'm Michael, and this episode is an experiment. It's an experiment in approaching a subject and trying to look at it in a broader context and perhaps from a little bit different perspective. Now, there are certain years that are so important that when you hear them, bang, something automatically pops in your head. It's as if you hit a switch and a light bulb flashes on and shines a light on a memory. They are years that are ingrained in your knowledge because you know for some reason that something really important happened then. Once you hear or see the four numbers, a certain event springs to memory, sometimes even multiple events. Author Haruki Murakami captured this idea really eloquently when he wrote, "No matter how much time passes, no matter what takes place in the interim, there are some things we can never assign to oblivion, memories we can never rub away." And Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote, "Time flies over us, but leaves its shadow behind." Time moves in one direction, memory in another. So says William Gibson. We all carry our history with us, sometimes unknowingly. And then there are folks like me and many of you who spend as much time in the past, it seems, as we do in the present. And I've been living in the 1830s for a few months now. Another author, Alice Walker, contributes another really wise thought. Time moves slowly but passes quickly. And by flying through the years to focus on 1836 in this work in progress, I hope that I can begin to build a kaleidoscope image that contributes to a better look at the world of 1836 and the events in Texas that shaped the future of the United States of America. Now, here are some examples illustrating what I'm talking about. One of the most obvious years to begin with is 1492, the year of Christopher Columbus's voyage. In terms of Texas history, which has its foundation in the history of Mexico and New Spain, Columbus does make sense even though he didn't set foot on the soil of North America. 1776 brings to mind the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. 1789 is the year that the Constitution replaced the Articles of Confederation and George Washington became the first president of the United States. And across the Atlantic, the French Revolution began. 1861, the American Civil War began, and in some circles it seems that it is still going on. 1876, well, that was the year Custer received a lesson in humility at Little Bighorn. 1914, that's the year the First World War began. 1929, the stock market crashed. 1939, Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War began. 1945, the Second World War ended, and the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 1963, that brings to mind the JFK assassination. 1964, that's the year of the Civil Rights Act, a landmark piece of civil rights legislation that prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. 1989, that was the year that the Berlin Wall fell. 1991, that was the year that the Soviet Union collapsed. 2001, well, that was the year of 9/11. And then there's January 6th, 2020. That's recent history that already seems to have 2 versions, what happened and what some people want you to think happened. And you can easily add more to the list. Year of your birthday, your anniversary, the year that your child was born, and you can add on and on a lot of personal things. But I'm talking about the big things that a lot of us have ingrained in our shared cultural, historical memory. And of course, there's 1836, the year emblazoned on hats and t-shirts across the Lone Star State at convenience stores and gas stations. It was the year Texas declared its independence. It was the year of the Alamo, Goliad, and San Jacinto. Its significance is definitely worthy of remembrance, but it is also a worthwhile experiment to place that monumental year in a broader context and consider it from a slightly different perspective. Putting 1836 into its historical context really is important Putting something in its historical context it's a fancy way of saying trying to understand what happened and why it happened based on the many things that helped make it and the world in which it happened. Texas in 1836, although it was separated by distance from a lot of places, did not exist in a vacuum. Despite the poor transportation and poor communication compared with today, it's amazing how well informed and connected people were in those years. That in itself is a lesson. They were functioning, even at the edge of settlement in the borderlands controlled by native nations, as difficult as it was, at the height of human achievement at that time. In 1836, it had been 344 years since Columbus sailed across the Atlantic and launched the Columbian Exchange. It had been 317 years since Hernando Cortez and a few hundred soldiers landed in Mexico and launched the conquest of the Aztec Empire, which would result in the creation of New Spain. It was also 317 years since Alonso Alvarez de Pineda sailed the Gulf Coast, discovered the mouth of the Mississippi River, and mapped the Texas coastline for the first time. Almost 300 years had passed since Coronado explored the southern plains and Hernando de Soto traversed the American South. It had been 238 years since Juan de Oñate occupied the land that is now New Mexico. Some are extremely fond of remembering this year, and some are not, because his arrival began the enslavement of New Mexico's native peoples. It was 229 years since the founding of Jamestown, and 217 years since the privateer, the White Lion, arrived at the British colony of Jamestown, Virginia, with 20 enslaved people from Africa in 1619. 1836 was just 200 years since the Puritans established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And jumping ahead a little bit more, 1836 was 156 years since the Pueblo people rose up in rebellion and forced Spain into a prolonged abandonment of New Mexico. This was followed by the Spanish founding of Corpus Christi de Isleta, the first Spanish mission in what would someday become Texas, a few miles from present-day El Paso. 3 years later, in 1685, the French explorer René Robert Cavelier, the Sieur de La Salle, landed in Texas by mistake while looking for the mouth of the Mississippi River and established a colony, Fort St. Louis, on Garcitas Creek in present-day Victoria County. 1846 was 146 years since construction began on the first East Texas mission, San Francisco de los Tejas, west of modern Nacogdoches, Texas. In 1836, it had been 130 years since the Spanish first recorded the presence of the Comanches in New Mexico. The people, the Numana, would be the lords of the southern plains for the next 170 years, long after the events of 1836. 118 years before 1836 saw the founding of the San Antonio de Valero mission. In 1836, its chapel would be known as the Alamo, and as that, it would be forevermore remembered. It had been 105 years since 55 Canary Islanders arrived in San Antonio to establish the civilian settlement San Fernando de Bexar, modern San Antonio. The next year, Georgia would be founded as a haven for debtors and a barrier against the Spanish. In 1836, it had been 96 years since the Comanches obtained firearms from French traders in 1740, and it had been 93 years since they had first visited San Antonio de Bexar in 1743. In 1836, it had been 78 years since the Comanches and their allies destroyed the Santa Cruz de San Saba mission near present-day Menard. The next year, 1759, a Spanish troop led by Diego Ortiz Perea marched across Texas on a campaign to punish the Norteños for destroying the mission. They fought a battle in October 1759 at a fortified Tavoya or Wichita village near the site of present-day Spanish Fort in Montague County. In 1761, 75 years before the events of 1836, Moses Austin had been born in Durham, Connecticut. It was 73 years since the Treaty of Paris formally ended the 7 Years' War in 1763, and 1836 was 74 years since France ceded Louisiana, west of the Mississippi, to Spain. In 1836, it had been 63 years since the Boston Tea Party in 1773. The first anti-slave convention in the history of the world was held in Philadelphia in 1775. And in 1836, it had been 60 years since British colonists declared their independence from Great Britain with a document containing the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." It was when the age of revolutions began, and those ideals became the mission in the American experiment that's still ongoing today. 1836 was 57 years after Bernardo de Galvez, the Spanish governor of Louisiana, launched several offenses at Baton Rouge and Natchez in 1779, and he established the basis for the reconquest of Florida. Galvez became the 49th Viceroy of New Spain in 1785, just 51 years before 1836, and it is his name that is attached to the island of Galveston and Galveston Bay. It had been 45 years since Philip Nolan, a protege of General James Wilkinson, first traveled to Texas in 1791. He was only 20 years old, and the Spanish authorities intercepted him and relieved him of his goods. But he still wandered extensively among the Comanches and the Tavoyas. In the next decade, his trading and mustanging operation carried him to San Antonio, Nacogdoches, and Central Texas, and to many more remote camps of Comanches and Tavoyas. The French Revolution started 47 years before in 1789. It ended in 1799 with Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to power. And Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin were both born in Virginia 43 years before 1836 in 1793. And another key figure for 1836, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, was born 42 years before 1836 in 1794. 38 years before, in 1798, the Spanish government granted Moses Austin a league of land in Missouri, where he began a lead mining operation. George Washington died in 1799, meaning he had only been in his grave for 37 years when 1836 came around. And he had correctly said a phrase that captured the age. Liberty, when it begins to take root, is a plant of rapid growth. 36 years before, in 1800, Alessandro Volta invented the electric battery, and Philip Nolan, who we mentioned just a minute ago, he died at the hands of Spanish soldiers in Central Texas in 1801, 35 years before 1836. In 1836, it had only been 33 years since Napoleon had sold Louisiana to the United States in 1803, and Napoleon crowned himself emperor the next year. 1803 was also the year that William Blake painted the Great Red Dragon and the Woman Clothed in Sun. A man of words as well as art, he wrote, "In the universe there are things that are known and things that are unknown, and in between there are doors." Blake is an especially interesting contributor to our culture. Blake claimed to have started seeing visions when he was quite a young boy, and when he was only 4 years old, he claimed he witnessed God, quote, "put his head to the window." While taking a walk through the countryside when he was about 9 years old, about 70 years before 1836, he claimed to have seen a tree filled with angels. And that same year, 1803, the year that Blake painted the dragon and the woman, a company of lancers, a flying company, Compania Volante, from Alamo de Parras, were stationed at the old San Antonio de Valero mission to protect the northern frontier. They came from San Jose y Santiago de Alamo de Parras in Coahuila, a village founded over 100 years before 1836. And now, while they were called the Second Flying Company of San Carlos de Parras, but another name was commonly used for them, and it was the Alamo de Parras Company. Over time, that name, Alamo, became associated with the old church. 30 years before 1836, in 1836, people from the native nations east of the Mississippi began to move into Spanish Texas. 22 years before 1836, following the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804, Haiti became the world's first state to arise from a slave rebellion. This filled Southerners with fear for decades. It was 30 years in 1836 after the Lewis and Clark expedition set out for the Pacific Northwest in 1806. That same year, Francisco de Miranda attempted an unsuccessful invasion to gain the independence of Venezuela, and a young man named David G. Burnett, born in New Jersey in 1788, accompanied Miranda as a lieutenant in the Army as the ship the Leander sailed from New York Harbor with Miranda's yellow, blue, and red standard flying proudly. Burnett fought in Chile in 1807, Venezuela in 1808, and returned to the United States in 1812 after Miranda and Simón Bolívar had a falling out, and it would be Burnett who in 1836 served as president of Texas during the Texas War for Independence. 1836 was 26 years after parish priest Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla issued the Cry of Dolores on September 16, 1810, and launched the Mexican War of Independence against Spain. Simón Bolívar began his military involvement in the Venezuelan War of Independence that same year, and Hidalgo sent a 36-year-old man from Revilla, modern-day Guerrero, named José Gutiérrez de Lara, to recruit along the Rio Grande. The next year, in 1811, Gutiérrez de Lara traveled to the United States to organize assistance to the rebellion. He met with Secretary of State James Monroe and explained his plan of establishing a Republican government in Texas and using it as a base for assisting the Mexican War for Independence. And this was 25 years before the events that happened in 1836. In 1836, it was 24 years since the War of 1812 began, and 21 years since Jackson led his forces in defeating the British at the Battle of New Orleans. Jackson led a multiracial, multi-ethnic force, as Gutierrez and McGee did in their endeavors. Several War of 1812 veterans would be in Texas in the 1830s, including a Kentuckian named Ben Milam. Milam had been born in 1788 and served as a lieutenant in the 8th Regiment of the Kentucky Militia. Also 24 years before, in 1812, Gutierrez had successfully arranged an expedition to lead a Republican Army of the North with Augustus McGee into Texas. It was a multiracial force composed of Anglo-Americans, Tejanos, and Native Americans. The army arrived in Nacogdoches in November of 1912 and attracted more recruits before moving on to La Bahia. And McGee died in February 1813, and Samuel Kemper assumed his leadership role. The army defeated a Royalist army at the Battle of Rosillo in March. In April 1813, Gutierrez announced a provisional government for Texas with him as president. Gutierrez returned to Nacogdoches after the Junta at Bayard asked him to resign, after he had allowed the execution of Governor Salcedo and 13 Royalist officers. José Alvarez de Toledo y Dubois assumed Gutierrez's leadership role, and Kemper also left and returned to Louisiana with more than 100 Americans who had been upset with the execution of the governor and the Spanish Royalist officers. Reuben Ross succeeded him as commander of the Americans in the army, and he in turn was replaced by a gentleman named Henry Perry. These people will be involved in Texas later on also. Spanish General Joaquin de Arredondo destroyed the Republican Army of the North at the Battle of Medina, about 20 miles south of San Antonio, on August 18, 1813. And this was the bloodiest battle ever fought in Texas, including everything that happened in 1836. Fewer than 100 of the approximate 1,400-man army escaped to live. Lieutenant Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna served with Arredondo in this military mission, and he learned from this experience and would apply what he learned in 1836. Arredondo then oversaw the punishment of Texas. Over 300 persons were executed in San Antonio, and women were also imprisoned. Following Arredondo's orders, Spanish soldiers enacted a similar bloodbath of punishment throughout Texas. 23 years before 1836 and 1813, while these events were happening, a French sailor named Louis Michel Aury sailed from North Carolina with a Venezuelan commission to Cartagena. He assisted the independence fighters until a disagreement with Simón Bolívar A lot of people seem to not be able to get along with Bolivar. He then shifted his loyalties to work with a group of New Orleans associates wanting to establish a Mexican rebel port on the Texas coast. It was about 1813 to 1815 that an enslaved man, Joe, was born, and he would be in Texas by 1833, enslaved to William Barrett Travis. Now, Joe, unlike his master, would survive the Battle of the Alamo, and after Travis's death, he would remain enslaved, but would escape in 1837. Also in 1813, 23 years before, 1836, Jane Austen published her second novel, Pride and Prejudice. In its pages, Miss Carolyn Bingley correctly states, "I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading." 22 years before 1836, Andrew Jackson had led troops against the Creeks in modern Alabama at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in the year 1814. And it's at that battle that a young third lieutenant named Sam Houston demonstrated his bravery in an attack, but he also suffered a wound that would ail him for the rest of his life, and he became a protege of Andrew Jackson. Also 22 years before 1836, in 1816, Reuben Ross and Henry Perry, who I had mentioned just a couple of years before had been involved in the invasion of Texas with the Republican Army of the North, they had returned to Texas to supply arms and equipment to Captain Cordero, an anti-Spanish Comanche chief. Now, Reuben Ross's son, John Randolph Ross, and a nephew who was named Reuben Ross, would be in Texas to fight for independence in 1836. John served as an Indian agent for Sam Houston, and Reuben, the younger, missed fighting at San Jacinto by just 2 days. But back in 1816, 20 years before these events, after delivering the supplies and equipment to Captain Cordero, Henry Perry led about 300 men to Bolivar Peninsula just above Galveston and joined Louis Michel Horry on Galveston Island in March 1816. Also happening at this time, Jose Manuel de Herrera, an envoy for the Mexican revolutionaries, declared Galveston to be a port of the Mexican Republic with Horry as its commander in September 1816, just 20 years before the events of 1836. Francisco Javier Mina then arrived in November to Galveston with Colonel Guilford Dudley Young, and Perry and his men joined them and sailed to fight the Royalists in Tamaulipas. Not long after these revolutionary activities were taking place, two brothers, Jean and Pierre Lafitte, smoothly snatched control of Galveston away from Horry in 1817. James Bowie and his brothers would visit Lafitte to purchase enslaved people to illegally smuggle into the United States. In 1817, 19 years before 1836, David G. Burnett adventured alone in Texas. After injuring himself on the Colorado River, he was aided by some Comanches, and he lived with them for at least 2 years as he recovered. And then Ben Milam, the veteran from Kentucky, he traveled to Texas in 1818 to trade with the Comanches as well. And while there, he met young David G. Burnett, who was still living with them. Another significant thing that happened in 1818, far away from Texas, saw Mary Shelley's publication of Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, in 1818. The novel closes with the monster declaring his final words, "But soon," he cried with sad and solemn enthusiasm, "I shall die, and what I now feel be no longer felt. Soon these burning miseries will be extinct. I shall ascend my funeral pile triumphantly and exult in the agony of the torturing flames. The light of that conflagration will fade away. My ashes will be swept into the sea by the winds. My spirit will sleep in peace, or, if it thanks, it will not surely thank thus. Farewell." He sprung from the cabin window as he said this. Upon the ice raft, which lay close to the vessel, he was soon borne away by the waves and lost in darkness and distance. That same year that those words were published, in 1818, Andrew Jackson invaded Spanish Florida under the pretext of striking at the Seminoles and escaped slaves that were reported as threats to the United States settlers. Technically, this was not a war against Spain. Instead, it was an action of defense against people in Spanish territory. Jackson knew what he was doing, and before he set out, he wrote the following to President Monroe: "Let it be signified to me through any channel that the possession of the Floridas would be desirable to the United States, and in 60 days it will be accomplished." His actions led to the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 that transferred Florida to the United States. That same treaty also sought to set the Sabine River as the border between Texas and the United States. Now, 18 years later, in 1836, when Jackson by then was President of the United States, General Gaines would be waiting on the Texas border for a reason to strike at threatening Native Americans or assist Houston's army if the Mexican army crossed into United States territory or the disputed area of territory. The same method would be used after Texas became a state along the debated border of Texas and Mexico. Mexico considered an oasis the border, had been that way for a long time. The United States claimed land all the way to the Rio Grande, as Texas had, and another Jackson protege, President James K. Polk, ordered Zachary Taylor, a general in the United States Army, to establish a position on the Rio Grande River opposite of Matamoros, and this resulted in a violent skirmish and handed Polk a reason for war. Santa Anna, who lost at San Jacinto in 1836, by that time he was back in power by the end of the war and would lose millions of more square miles of Mexican territory to the United States. Also in 1818, the artist Caspar David Friedrich painted famous painting, "The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog." He said, "I have to surrender myself to what encircles me. I have to merge with my clouds and rocks in order to be what I am." 17 years before 1836, the Panic of 1819 ruined the economic fortunes of people throughout the United States, including Moses Austin, who was then living again in American territory. Also in 1819, Ben Milam met James Long and Jose Felix Tres Palacios in New Orleans, and he joined them in their venture to launch an expedition into Texas to aid the Mexican War of Independence. The expedition fell apart after initially capturing Nacogdoches. The next year, 16 years before 1836, in late 1820, Milam assisted Long in regrouping his expedition near Galveston. It was also in 1820 that Daniel Boone died. He had moved to Spanish Louisiana in 1799. Another significant event was Washington Irving publishing The Legend of Sleepy Hollow in 1820 as part of the sketchbook. It is one of the first fictional works by an American author to become popular outside the United States. Also, by 1820, more than half the adult white males were finally able to vote, except states like Virginia, Rhode Island, New York, and Louisiana, states that still retain property requirements or substantial tax requirements for the franchise. All women and anyone that was not white, of course, also could not vote. Women, free blacks, enslaved blacks, Native Americans, these people were residents of the United States, but without the rights of white men. In fact, many white men did not have the right to vote in the states that had the restrictions. Another thing that happened in 1820, 16 years before, Moses Austin had arrived in San Antonio in late 1820 to apply for permission to settle people from the United States into Texas. The next year, General Arredondo, on January 17, 1821, he approved Moses Austin's petition to bring 300 settlers into an area of 211,000 acres. But Austin died in June 1821 before he could make any progress. And Stephen F. Austin, Moses' son, continued his father's plans in Texas in 1821, 15 years before 1836. Also in 1821, Missouri became the 29th state in the United States. 1821 was also the year that the poet John Keats died in Rome and that Napoleon died in exile. Keats wrote, "Beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know." And Napoleon is said to have said, "Courage is like love. It must have hope for nourishment." Another key thing that happened in 1821, just a few years before the events of 1836, James Fenimore Cooper embarked upon his literary career with the publication of The Spy. Between 1823 and 1841, he would publish the books for which he is best known, the Leatherstocking Tales, which shaped American views of the frontier. 1821 is also the year that Argentine General José de San Martín declared the independence of Peru from the Spanish Empire, and Michael Faraday created an electricity-powered motor. William Becknell pioneered the Santa Fe Trail between Franklin, Missouri and Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1821. And 1821 found Milam and Tres Palacios traveling to Veracruz and Mexico City, where they were imprisoned. Also in 1821, the Treaty of Cordoba, signed in Cordoba, Veracruz, Mexico, it ratified the Plan of Iguala of February 24th for Mexico's independence from Spain. And on May 19th, 1822, Agustín de Iturbide was proclaimed Augustine I, Emperor of Mexico. And that same year, a 17-year-old Georgian named James Walker Fannin Jr. left the United States Military Academy at West Point. 14 years before 1836, in 1822, we return to James Long. At this time, Long had traveled to Mexico City to plead his case before the Emperor, Iturbide, and mysteriously, a guard shot and killed Long. Ben Milam believed that Tres Palacios had hired the guard to kill him. 13 years before 1836, on January 4th, 1823, Emperor Iturbide signed the first permit for Stephen F. Austin to settle Anglo-Americans in Texas. Iturbide soon after abdicated in March of 1823. Also in 1823, a young poet and newspaper publisher named Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar had become the secretary for newly elected Georgia Governor George M. Troup. Lamar married in 1826, but his wife fell ill with tuberculosis. He was then elected as a Georgia state senator in 1829, and after his wife died, he withdrew from the 1830 re-election campaign to mourn. Another poet, Lord Byron, died in Greece in 1824, 12 years before 1836. Of the many poetic lines he penned, he wrote, "There are 4 questions of value in life. What is sacred? Of what is the spirit made? What is worth living for? And what is worth dying for? The answer to each is the same, only love." Now, a Kentuckian named James Melville Allen had traveled to support Greek independence after serving in the United States Navy, and he was there with Lord Byron when he died. The year before, in 1823, Sam Houston had been a vocal supporter of Greek independence as well, and 11 years later, John Melville Allen participated in General Jose Antonio Mejia's Tampico expedition as an act of rebellion against Santa Anna, and in 1836, Allen fought under Sam Houston to defeat Santa Anna at San Jacinto, and it was this Kentuckian who was present when Lord Byron died. He would be the first mayor of Galveston in 1839. 11 years before the events of 1836, President John Quincy Adams in 1825 had Henry Clay send Poinsett to start discussions with the Mexican government about readjusting the United States boundary with Texas. The Sabine River was not satisfactory any longer, and the United States wanted to push its claim, why not to the Brazos, or how about the Colorado, or, if possible, to the Rio Grande. Now, at this time, nothing progressed from these attempts, but the eyes of many in the United States remained focused on the territory that Americans were settling. 1825, another significant thing that happened that year. It was also the year that the Erie Canal connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. In 1836, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, founding fathers who had both served as president, they had only been dead for 10 years. They both passed away on July 4th, 1826, and according to Gordon S. Wood, historian, they were disillusioned and disappointed in the direction the country they had helped found had taken. It was a place in which the goal was chasing the accumulation of wealth, and the Americans were a money-hungry people. 1826 was the year that David G. Burnett returned to Texas and settled as a citizen in the Mexican Republic. In 1836, Beethoven had only been dead for 9 years. The brilliant creator is credited with writing, "Music is the one incorporeal entrance into the higher world of knowledge. which comprehends mankind, but which mankind cannot comprehend. The next year, in 1827, under President John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay wrote Poinsett that the president was willing to promote the success of the negotiations over the border with Texas, quote, by throwing into it other motives than those which strictly belong to the subject itself. Therefore, he was authorized to offer $1 million for a line beginning at the mouth of the Rio Grande, following that river in the Pecos to the source of the latter, thence north to the Arkansas, then along that river in the 42nd parallel to the Pacific Ocean. For the alternate line of the Colorado, he might offer $500,000. 8 years before 1836, in 1828, New York State abolished slavery. And 1828 also saw Old Hickory Andrew Jackson being elected president. This election was the first in which non-property holding white males were able to vote in the vast majority of states. The next year, 1829, President Andrew Jackson had Secretary Van Buren write Poinsett again to renew the overtures to Mexico that Adams had started. And they suggested 4 lines as acceptable in varying degrees to the United States. The most desirable, they stressed again, would begin in the center of the desert or Grand Prairie west of the Nueces. The next would follow the Lavaca River, the third the Colorado, and the fourth the Brazos. They really wanted that territory and kept pressuring and pushing and goading Mexico, trying to get them to agree. But it wasn't happening. 6 years before, in 1830, Mexico established the law of April 6th, which sought to limit immigration from the United States, along with stopping the spread of slavery from the United States. 6 years before 1836, the forced displacement of about 60,000 people of the 5 civilized tribes in the southeastern United States began in 1830 with Andrew Jackson's successful passage of the Indian Removal Act. Tennessee Congressman David Crockett opposed the legislation. Now, if you recall, several years before, about 1806, several members of these nations and others had already started moving into Spanish Texas. 5 years before the events of 1836, Jedediah Strong Smith, explorer, trader, and trapper, was killed by Comanches on the Santa Fe Trail in 1831. He'd been born in New York in 1799. 1831 was also the year of Nat Turner's slave rebellion in Southampton, Virginia, in which as many as 120 enslaved people and free African Americans and between 55 and 65 white people died. Historian Herbert Aptheker documented at least 250 slave revolts and conspiracies to revolt in the years before the Civil War. In 1833, 3 years before, the Parliament of the United Kingdom passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which set in motion the gradual abolition of slavery in most of the British Empire. And 3 years before, 1836, in February 1833, Sam Houston wrote the following to President Jackson in a letter dated at Natchitoches, Louisiana, February 13, 1833. And he wrote, "Having been so far as Bear, in the province of Texas, I am now in possession of some information which will doubtless be interesting to you and may be calculated to forward your views, if should entertain any, touching the acquisition of Texas by the government of the United States. That such a measure is desired by 19/20 of the population of the province, I cannot doubt. The people of Texas are determined to form a state government and separate from Coahuila. And unless Mexico is soon restored to order and the Constitution revived and reenacted, the province of Texas will remain separate from the Confederacy of Mexico. My opinion is that Texas, by her members in convention, will by 1st of April declare all that country as Texas proper and form a state constitution. I expect to be present at the convention and will apprise you of the course adopted as soon as its members have taken a final action. It is probable that I may make Texas my abiding place. In adopting this course, I will never forget the country of my birth." Also in 1833, Santa Anna, who had been with Arredondo, he had become president of Mexico. And in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, William Lloyd Garrison and Arthur Tappan founded the American Anti-Slavery Society. And in 1833, in Munster, Westphalia, a baby girl was born and named Francisca Bernardina Wilhelmina Elizabeth Ney. Elizabeth Ney would grow up to become a renowned sculptor, and she would move to Texas with her husband in 1872 and become one of the first professional sculptors in the state. And her works, this little child that was born 3 years before the events of 1836, her works would be instrumental in immortalizing many of the people that were alive in Texas in 1836, including Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin. At the time of their deaths, neither man was held in very high regard for various reasons, but the historical myth-making industry, which included Ney, would change their status. Also of consequence from 3 years before the events of 1836 were events in the heavens. 1833 was the year of the kid's birth and his mother's death in Blood Meridian. The author wrote, "Night of your birth, 33, the Leonids they were called. God knows the stars did fall. I looked for blackness, holes in the heavens, the dipper stove." Somebody else named Agnes Clark described the events as well, writing, "On the night of November 12th and 13th, 1833, a tempest of falling stars broke over the earth. The sky was scored in every direction with shining tracks and illuminated with majestic fireballs. At Boston, the frequency of meteors was estimated to be half that of flakes of snow in an average snowstorm. Their numbers were quite beyond counting, but as it waned, a reckoning was attempted, from which it was computed on the basis of that much diminished rate that 240,000 must have been visible during the 9 hours they continued to fall. A Southern farmer said, 'The world is now actually coming to an end, for the stars are falling.' And Joseph Smith, founder of the Mormon Church, wrote, 'I arose and to my great joy beheld the stars fall from heaven like a shower of hailstones,' a literal fulfillment of the Word of God as recorded in the Holy Scriptures as a sure sign that the coming of Christ is close at hand." Also in 1833, 3 years before the events of 1836, William Whewell coined the term scientist, which came to replace use of natural philosopher. And the next year, a couple of years before the events of 1836, James W. Fannin Jr. moved from Georgia to Velasco, Texas in 1834, where he set up a plantation and traded and enslaved people. George Bancroft, the father of American history, began publishing his 10-volume comprehensive history of the United States. He would work on it for the next 40 years and cover the period from colonial times to American independence. And 1 year before 1836, in 1835, Samuel Langhorne Clemens, better known as Mark Twain, was born in Florida, Missouri. He never came to Texas, but he gave a lecture in 1900 to raise money to assist in the aftermath of the great hurricane that devastated the island. And oddly enough, he apparently owned land in Archer County. And finally, we reached the year 1836 to look at the events and significant things that happened in that year.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, "Hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby," and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
Every day, thousands of Comcast engineers and technologists, like Kunle, put people at the heart of everything they create.
In the average household, there are dozens of connected devices. Here in the Comcast family, we're building an integrated in-home Wi-Fi solution for millions of families like my own. It brings people together in meaningful ways.
Kunle and his team are building a Wi-Fi experience that connects 1 billion devices every year. Learn more about how Comcast is redefining the future of connectivity at comcastcorporation.com/Wi-Fi.
But I think that's enough. I think we'll take a pause here and break this up and follow it up with a focus on 1836 in the next episode. I kind of got carried away with the build up to the year, and I could just keep going on, and then eventually I will, and try to tie all of this stuff together into a more comprehensible narrative showing how all of these events tied together. Some directly and some very indirectly, but in some tangent, did have an influence on creating this world. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to offer your suggestions. What significant things should be added to this timeline, this experiment in context and perspective, and I'll gladly consider adding to it, because this is a work in progress. And we'll see you soon with another episode focusing on 1836. And yeah, that does it. The theme music is provided by Derek McClendon. Go check his songs out everywhere you listen to music. And we'll be back soon. Take care of yourself. Take care of one another. Be kind. Adios.